YouTuber Felix Rex has a video on the modern artistic malaise, the total lack of originality we see these days, the endless reboots and sequels, wherein he says this:
We as a species have reached the ceiling of our creative abilities. Maybe we've, in our globalized world, thought up every genre of storytelling. Maybe we have basically taxed our collective imaginations to the point where we're trying to draw proverbial water from a stone.
And maybe he's right. Maybe we have told every story there is to tell, and all we can do now is retell the same tired old dramas. But I have to say this.
Mazda. Feel alive.
When you can push out a mass market ad campaign based on how the average viewer feels dead inside, that may not be a generation that's really capable of pushing the artistic envelope. This is our first series, a series that really began with our first video and crudest attempt at one. All I can do is ask for patience as we learn this video editing stuff. But the Holocaust Engine is a survival horror series based on the modern mental illness crisis and set against the backdrop of the Judeo-Christian prophecies concerning the apocalypse. And even though these aren't works of religious fiction, the way these prophecies are lining up is getting kind of eerie. With that in mind, we kick off part one of a series we're just going to call Revelation, and start our series on those similarities with a look at the fourth trumpet of the biblical end times. Of course, we really can't see the celestial lights the way we used to, thanks to air and light pollution. But those images, sun, moon, stars, all symbolize something else. To the Hebrews, and in every culture that I know of, they symbolize transcendence, the idea of the spiritual world bleeding over into the physical world. This is why gold and silver had such high value to begin with, why people wore jewelry and kings wore crowns. Gold reminded the ancients of sunlight, just as silver reminded them of moonlight, and wearing these articles in their minds heightened their connection with the spiritual world. We still call the people we idolize stars. Idolize, as in consider them above us in some sort of metaphysical frame. And art itself? Since mankind's earliest days, art was viewed as a spiritual aesthetic, an attempt to bring the spiritual world into our world through things like visual mediums and storytelling. But since the Industrial Revolution, this idea has gradually given way to a concept of art as a mathematical formula. And this is only accelerated in our modern, hyper-connected world. In this series, we're going to show what humanity thinks transcendence looks like, what it sounds like when we turn it into music, how we got here, and what we can do to escape the malaise. But first, we're going to start by tracing an artistic adaptation that covers everything else we're going to be looking at later, all piled into one absolute train wreck. Before we talk about the loss of transcendence in concept, we're going to see it in practice. We're going to see what happens when the light of something transcendent gets dimmed, all the way down to mere formula. We're going to look at what happened to Game of Thrones.
I think originality is bunk. I think it's nonsense. There never has been such a thing as true originality.
In the Netflix series The Creative Brain, neuroscientist David Eagleman presents consciousness as nothing more than the residue of a computer made of living tissues that we call our brain. He's not alone in this characterization. This is the standard modern belief concerning consciousness. The series itself has an emphasis on novelty that certainly makes sense, giving yourself new knowledge and experience so that you can then transform it into something different. I think almost every artist would agree with that. The series also has lots of MRI scans and lots of testimonials. It pulls artists from all sorts of fields, all agreeing with Eagleman that there's a formula for tapping into the creativity in us all. And who is the representative it wheels out to tell us that we don't need a soul for the literary vein of artistic creation? It's this guy, part of the dynamic duo known to Game of Thrones fans as D&D, because apparently hitting Control-C, Control-V over and over again is now considered an art form. Listen, it's not like these two were the first to outrun their source material and find out they couldn't replicate the thing that made that source material compelling. The first Matrix movie, the good one, was taken from a graphic novel. The later ones, with all the silly dancing, were the ones where the directors tried to do it on their own. Pirates of the Caribbean? That one filched the storyboard from a computer game. Then after that, just tried to string movie scripts around Johnny Depp's drunk act. But why couldn't D&D replicate the magic of the books? If you listen to the book's author, George R.R. Martin, talk, it sounds like his creative process is just focused on limiting distractions and thinking outside the box of an outline. Too bad he seems to have written himself into a corner. You know what would have avoided that, right? An outline.
Thousands of years ago, there came a night that lasted a generation. In that darkness, the White Walkers came for the first time. They swept through cities and kingdoms, riding their dead horses, hunting with their packs of pale spiders.
But make no mistake, Martin knows his history. For anyone that doesn't already know, Game of Thrones used actual events and characters from the late medieval England as a kind of scaffold on which to add all of its fantasy and fictional elements. The reason this is important is that portraying your characters' actions and dialogue in a realistic way is one of the hardest jobs of the writer. And a little aside here to make this point. In my early days in the justice system, every time an officer involved shooting went before the grand jury, someone would always ask the question, "Officer, why didn't you just try and shoot the gun out of his hand?" I'm not joking. Of course, if you know anything at all about firearms ballistics, you know that's a ridiculous question. You can't hit something as small as a handgun from any distance, even without stress. So where did they get that silly idea? They got it from the serial westerns of the 50s and 60s. This was the mid-90s, and a lot of people on these grand juries had grown up on those westerns. And here's my point. If you don't know something from experience, you tend to assume it from something else. You may not even realize where those assumptions came from. For those grand jurors who had never handled firearms themselves, who grew up on classic westerns, they formed the assumption that this kind of trick shot was not just possible, but entirely ordinary. What they didn't know was that the reason those shows had the villain getting the gunshot out of his hand was simply because they were written for network television, and, at the time, needed a way to resolve the story without getting censored for showing what a Colt 45 slug does to a human body. And so the jurors asked a really stupid question, not knowing that it was stupid, because they didn't know to challenge their own assumptions. Now, back to Game of Thrones. We can all think of movies and shows where the characters do something incredibly unrealistic, something that pulls us out of the storyline because it's so unbelievable. You know the character wouldn't do that. But the writer may not have known that, simply because it wasn't in their realm of experience to know how a real person would react in that particular circumstance. In a long enough story, with all sorts of characters and hundreds of individual responses, it can be like a minefield, where eventually you hit a bad assumption. The writer didn't know, but they thought they knew. How does Martin get past this faulty assumption problem? He does it by mirroring actual historical events, and in that way, he doesn't have to know whether or not a character would react in a certain way, because a real-life human already did. So why didn't D&D just pick up a few history books from the time period? Okay, follow me on this one. History is a very specific discipline. Prior to the rise of Christianity, it was almost unique to three ancient cultures: the Hebrews, the Chinese, and the Greeks. That's it. Why just those three? Because each of those cultures had an all-powerful God concept. The Hebrews with Yahweh, the Greek elites with the philosophy of the so-called first cause, and the Chinese with the celestial All-Father, Sung Di. Outside of those traditions, and the ones they influenced, if you're reading an ancient text, you're almost certainly not reading what we would now call a historical record, a set of actual events recorded as they actually occurred, because the writer believed that there was an intrinsic value in understanding reality. Most likely, you're probably reading a spell, some sort of spell casting, in which the scribe, like the Egyptian scribe who engraved this, wasn't attempting to record reality, but intended to alter reality by carving this incantation into the stone. Of course, this really created some problems for those cultures. There's an old saying, you can deny reality, but you can't deny the consequences of reality. Take the ancient Egyptians, for example, who probably had more confidence in their magical control over the world than any other ancient people. It meant that they tended to be their own worst enemies. Even with the massive advantage of the Nile River basin, they could never really extend their empire past that narrow strip of land. And they tried. Boy, did they try. There's one region they invaded 18 times in 11 years. 18 times. You would think they would have tried a different tactic, or simply given up. But that's only because you don't believe in magic. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that before almost every one of those campaigns, a certain group of magicians managed to convince a certain pharaoh that they just needed another chance to get the spells right to make the next campaign a success. And this happened again and again and again. Now, back to our guys, who, like the ancient Egyptians, didn't seem to care much for history, and almost certainly, like the Egyptians, had a whole lot of misplaced confidence in their own abilities. The Egyptians got theirs from the annual flooding of the Nile, an event which they managed to convince themselves they were doing through their own magical arts. D&D probably got much of theirs from winning Emmy after Emmy for doing nothing more than trimming down someone else's life's work. And this became painfully obvious once they had nothing more to trim down. There's a moment in the series, even before they ran out of all the source material, where the writers tipped their hand on the carnage that was to come. There's a scene in Season 5 where Littlefinger finds himself surrounded by the fantasy version of the Archbishop of Canterbury's, so the High Sparrow's, minions, and is stopped by one of those minions, Brother Lancel. Lancel rebukes Littlefinger for running a brothel. Littlefinger answers with a line that's not in the books.
We both peddle fantasies, Brother Lancel. Mine just happened to be entertaining.
The problem with this is that it's nothing that the Littlefinger of the books, or even almost anyone living in our medieval era, would have said. The fantasy in question is clearly the Sparrow's religious sentiments. But that sort of skepticism is a product of the modern, post-industrial world, D&D's world. The faulty assumption is thinking that anyone would have held it back then. The truth is almost no one held it prior to the 1700s. And in this show, we're not talking about the actual medieval era. We're talking about a sword and sorcery world of shape-shifting assassins and fire-breathing dragons. Skepticism of the metaphysical in that kind of world would just be idiotic. My gosh, look up. That's a world of the metaphysical as something repeatable and predictable, not infinite and therefore mysterious like in monotheistic belief. And so the default worldview would be what we call paganism, a worldview with gods and spirits but without anything supreme and all-powerful. With that worldview, people relate to the metaphysical world, and typically to each other, through manipulation and control. They don't deny the existence of the spiritual realm. They want to find out what that realm needs and how to trade for it. That's what we call magic, and it maps onto the historical events of 15th century England really well, because that's what people tended to believe back then, who, Christianized in name, still tended to think in terms of the old Roman and Celtic pagan belief systems. England on the whole didn't really start thinking in monotheistic terms until the later puritanical movements. Of course, D&D don't think in either one of those worldviews. They think in the modern, empirical humanistic worldview that now dominates our thinking. And this was their undoing, because if you don't realize the people you're supposed to be writing about think differently than you do, then you're not going to understand why they did what they did in those earlier seasons, or how they should react in the later ones. They seem to realize that they didn't understand this world. Did you notice in the last season, especially in the first 4 episodes, how much of the dialogue was just references to earlier events? Almost like the writers couldn't figure out what the characters should be saying, and so just had them repeating themselves like robots. They didn't understand them, and so, just like our grand jurors, when they ran out of events to repeat, they started making assumptions. Bad assumptions. And more specifically, when someone sees the world through the current humanistic lens that denies the very existence of the soul, and thinks that we're just biological machines, they're going to assume that the characters are motivated by purely material reasons, not religious or transcendental ones. What happens to your writing just in general when you think like that? YouTuber Vito has an hour-long critique of the last Star Wars movie. He hates it, thinks it's nothing more than a shadow of the original movies. Why does he hate it? At the 56:15 mark, he sums it up by saying, for some reason, it all just feels soulless now. And of course it does. Same dynamic. One person's vision getting unceremoniously fleshed out by the Twitter generation. This time, a whole company of them. Same loss of vitality. And notice this. It even has the same lack of concern for its own history. This time, in the rejection of the books and the comics. Thoughty 2 has a good video on the subject, linked below. But I would take issue with the title of the video. The video answers the question how modern movies are terrible, but not so much why. He takes a stab at it by talking about how movies are funded, but I'd push back on that. If all they cared about was money, we'd see more family movies, less political pieces, and Oscar bait. Obviously, social standing is at least as much of a concern to the studio execs, if not more. No, I think the real why is found in the changing modern worldview. A worldview that makes everything feel soulless.
Mazda. Feel alive.
And, in a world that denies the very existence of a living soul, why should anyone be surprised that so many of us, increasingly, just feel dead inside? Remember these themes: a generational gap, a denial of the metaphysical world by the latter generation, and a lack of concern for their own history. In the next video, we're going to look at the conditions of the two main flourishings of art in the recorded history of the Western world. We're going to briefly see transcendence through the eyes of artists, and we're going to talk about why it is that modern humanity doesn't seem to care about its own backstory anymore. This is David Reichert from The Bunker. Hit like and subscribe and click the notification bell, and we'll try and put out at least one video a week. Also, our pandemic horror series, The Holocaust Engine, is available September 14th. Link for pre-order down below.